for leaving the European Union. Today, the fifth round of negotiations begins in Brussels, and this government is getting on with the job of delivering the democratic will of the British people. As I set out in my speech in Florence, we want to take a creative and pragmatic approach to securing a new, deep and special partnership with the European Union, which spans both a new economic relationship and a new security relationship. So let me set out what each of these relationships could look like before turning to how we get there. Mr. Speaker, I have been clear that when we leave the European Union, we will no longer be members of its single market or its customs union. The British people voted for control of their borders, their laws and their money, and that is what this government is going to deliver. At the same time, we want to find a creative solution to a new economic relationship.
Order. Members must calm themselves. A little harsh. The honourable gentleman member for Southwark and Bermondsey has had something for breakfast which I counselled colleagues to avoid. Prime Minister.
At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we want to find a creative solution to a new economic relationship that can support prosperity for all our peoples. We do not want to settle for adopting a model enjoyed by other countries. So if we have rejected the idea of something based on European Economic Area membership, for this would mean having to adopt automatically and in their entirety new EU rules over which in future we will have little influence and no vote. Neither are we seeking a Canadian-style free trade agreement, for compared with what exists today, this would represent such a restriction on our mutual market access that it would benefit none of our economies. Instead, I'm proposing a unique and ambitious economic partnership. It will reflect our unprecedented position of starting with the same rules and regulations. We will maintain our unequivocal commitment to free trade and high standards, and we will need a framework to manage where we continue to align and when we choose to differ. There will be areas of policy and regulation which are outside the scope of our trade and economic relations where this should be straightforward. There will be areas which do affect our economic relations, where we and our European friends may have different goals, or where we share the same goals but want to achieve them through different means. And there will be areas where we want to achieve the same goals in the same ways because it makes sense for our economies. And because rights and obligations must be held in balance, the decisions we both take will have consequences for the UK's access to the EU market and EU access to our market. But this dynamic, creative and unique economic partnership will enable the UK and the EU to work side by side in bringing shared prosperity to our peoples. Let me turn now to the new security relationship. As I said when I visited our troops, when I visited our troops serving on the NATO mission in Estonia last month, the United Kingdom is unconditionally committed to maintaining Europe's security. And we will continue to offer aid and assistance to EU member states that are the victims of armed aggression, terrorism and natural or man-made disasters. So we are proposing a bold new strategic agreement that provides a comprehensive framework for future security, law enforcement and criminal justice cooperation, a treaty between the UK and the EU. We're also proposing a far-reaching partnership on how together we protect Europe from the threats we face in the world today. So this partnership will be unprecedented in its breadth and depth, taking in cooperation on diplomacy, defence and security and development. So let me turn to how we build a bridge from where we are now to the new relationship that we want to see. When we leave the European Union on the 29th of March 2019, neither the UK nor the EU and its member states will be in a position to implement smoothly many of the detailed arrangements that will underpin this new relationship we seek. Businesses will need time to adjust and governments will need to put new systems in place and businesses want certainty about the position in the interim. That's why I suggested in my speech at Lancaster House there should be a period of implementation, and why I proposed such a period in my speech in Florence last month. During this strictly time-limited period, we will have left the EU and its institutions, but we are proposing that for this period, access to one another's market should continue on current terms, and Britain also should continue to take part in existing security measures. The framework for this period, which can be agreed under Article 50, would be the existing structure of EU rules and regulations. Now, I know that some people may have some concerns about this, but there are two reasons why it makes sense. First, we want our departure from the EU to be as smooth as possible. It wouldn't make sense to make people and businesses plan for two sets of changes in the relationship between the UK and the EU. Second, we should concentrate on negotiating time and capital on what really matters, the future long-term relationship we will have with the EU after this temporary period ends. During the implementation period, people will continue to be able to come and live and work in the UK, but there will be a registration system, an essential preparation for the new immigration system required to retake control of our borders. And our intention is that new arrivals will be subject to new rules for EU citizens on long-term settlement. We will also push forward on our future independent trade policy, talking to trading partners across the globe and preparing to introduce those deals once this period is over. How long the period should be is determined simply by how long it will take to prepare and implement the new systems we need. And as of today, these considerations point to an implementation period of around 2 years. As I said in Florence, because I don't believe that either the EU or the British people want us to stay longer in the existing structures than necessary, we could also agree to bring forward aspects of that future framework, such as new dispute resolution mechanisms, more quickly if this can be done smoothly. At the heart of these arrangements, there should be a double lock, guaranteeing a period of implementation, giving businesses and people the certainty they will be able to prepare for the change, and guaranteeing this implementation period will be time-limited, giving everyone the certainty this will not go on forever. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Florence speech was to move the negotiations forward, and that is exactly what has happened. As Michel Barnier said after the last round, there is a new dynamic in the negotiations, and I want to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, for all he has done to drive through real and tangible progress on a number of vital areas. On citizens' rights, as I've said many times, this government greatly values the contribution of all EU citizens who've made their lives in our country. We want them to stay. In Florence, I gave further commitments that the rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU will not diverge over time, committing to incorporate our agreement on citizens' rights fully into UK law and making sure the UK courts can refer directly to it. Since Florence, there has been more progress, including reaching agreement on reciprocal healthcare and pensions and encouraging further alignment on a range of important social security rights. So I hope our negotiating teams can now reach full agreement quickly. On Northern Ireland, we have now begun drafting joint principles on preserving the common travel area and associated rights. And we have both stated explicitly we will not accept any physical infrastructure at the border. We owe it to the people of Northern Ireland and indeed to everyone on the island of Ireland to get this right. Then there is the question of the EU budget. As I've said, this can only be resolved as part of the settlement of all the issues that we are working through. Still, I do not want our partners to fear that they will need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current budget plan as a result of our decision to leave. The UK will honour commitments we have made during the period of our membership. And as we move forwards, we will also want to continue working together in ways that promote the long-term economic development of our continent. This includes continuing to take part in those specific policies and programmes which are greatly to our joint advantage, such as those that promote science, education and culture, and those that promote our mutual security. And as I set out in my speech at Lancaster House, in doing so, we would want to make a contribution to cover our fair share of the costs involved. Mr. Speaker, I continued discussions on many of these issues when I met with European leaders in Tallinn at the end of last month. And in the bilateral discussions I've had with Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Szydło, President Tusk and the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, they welcomed the tone set in Florence and the impact this was having on moving the negotiations forwards. Preparing for life outside the EU is also about the legislative steps we take. Our EU withdrawal bill will shortly enter committee stage, carrying over EU rules and regulations into our domestic law from the moment we leave the EU. And today, we are publishing 2 white papers on trade and customs. These pave the way for legislation to allow the UK to operate as an independent trading nation and to create an innovative customs system that will help us achieve the greatest possible tariff and barrier-free trade as we leave the EU. And while I believe it is profoundly in all our interests for the negotiations to succeed, it is also our responsibility as a government to prepare for every eventuality. So that is exactly what we are doing. These white papers also support that work, including setting out steps to minimise disruption for businesses and travellers. Mr. Speaker, a new deep and special partnership between a sovereign United Kingdom and a strong and successful European Union is our ambition and our offer to our European friends. Achieving that partnership will require leadership and flexibility, not just from us, but from our friends, the 27 nations of the EU. And as we look forward to the next stage, the ball is in their court, but I'm optimistic it will receive a positive response. Because what we are seeking is not just the best possible deal for us, but I believe that will also be the best possible deal for our European friends too. So while, of course, progress will not always be smooth, by approaching these negotiations in a constructive way, in a spirit of friendship and cooperation, and with our sights firmly set on the future, I believe we can prove the doomsayers wrong. And I believe we can seize the opportunities of this defining moment in the history of our nation. Mr. Speaker, a lot of the day-to-day coverage is about process. But this, on the other hand, is vitally important. I am determined to deliver what the British people voted for and to get it right. That is my duty as Prime Minister. It is our duty as a government, and it is what we will do. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the Prime Minister for the advanced copy of the statement. 16 months on from the referendum, no real progress has been made. The Prime Minister delivered yet another definitive speech, designed to herald a breakthrough, which instead only confirmed the confusion at the heart of government. Mr. Speaker, if we want to judge the progress the government has made since triggering Article 50, we shouldn't just look at the latest Florence speech. We should also look back at the Prime Minister's last big Brexit speech in January, where she outlined 12 objectives for Brexit negotiations. And, Mr. Speaker, how many of those objectives has the government met 10 months down the line? The answer, none. The Florence speech, in fact, demonstrated the scale of the mess the government is making of these negotiations. 15 months on from the referendum, we're still no clearer what the future of this country will look like. The question must be asked, what on earth has the government been doing all this time? Calling an election in which voters refused to give the Prime Minister the mandate she wanted. Since then, Cabinet ministers have been squabbling amongst themselves all that time. 15 months wasted. I'm sure the Prime Minister wanted her speech in Florence to bring life to these critical negotiations. On the substance of the speech itself, I'm pleased that the Prime Minister has taken Labour's lead and accepted the need for transition as we leave the EU. However, Mr. Speaker, it is still unclear what the Prime Minister envisages for a transitional period or how long it will last. The Prime Minister said the implementation period would last around 2 years, yet the Foreign Secretary interprets that as 2 years and not a second more, while the Chancellor hints it might be more. He's here, he could correct us on this. She told us during a transition, access to one another's markets should continue on current terms. Yet, at the Conservative Party conference, the Secretary of State for International Trade contradicted this and said, we will leave the single market and the customs union at the end of March 2019. The immigration minister told his party conference that freedom of movement will end as we know it in March 2019. So how does this square with the Prime Minister's assertion that we continue on current terms during the transition? It can't be both. Can the Prime Minister clear up the confusion and tell the House exactly what her implementation period means in terms of the single market, customs union and freedom of movement? Mr. Speaker, on the financial settlement with the EU, the Prime Minister has offered to commit funds to ensure no EU member state has to pay more into the EU budget until the end of the current framework. We welcome this as a sensible offer. However, can the Prime Minister confirm whether the UK will be willing to pay money to the EU post-transition to access programmes which benefit this country? It's an important issue for many parts of Britain. On the issue of citizens' rights, the Prime Minister says this is an area where progress has been made with the EU. I'm sure that many colleagues in this House will testify to the level of concern and indeed desperation of many of our constituents who come to our surgeries across the country in fear that families and friendships will soon be ripped apart. So, Mr. Speaker, no, it's not scaremongering, Mr. Speaker. This is a serious issue. This is a serious issue that affects many people in this country, day in, day out, who are frankly frightened of the future. So, Mr. Speaker, I call on the Prime Minister again today, listen to the TUC and the CBI and unilaterally guarantee the rights of EU nationals living in the UK. Given, Mr. Speaker, that this House voted in July 2016 to unilaterally guarantee the rights of EU citizens, can the Prime Minister finally reflect the will of the House and give people and businesses the assurances they need? On Northern Ireland, we welcome the drafting of joint principles, but 15 months on from the referendum, we should be beyond platitudes and negotiating the practicalities. Yep. Mr. Speaker, the speech in Florence was supposed to put momentum into the Brexit negotiations. It is staggering. It is staggering, Mr. Speaker, that after...
there was a lot of noise when the Prime Minister began her statement, and I indicated that people should calm down, and the same applies now. The right honourable gentleman will be heard. He will be heard with courtesy, and he will be heard in full. Jeremy Corbyn.
It is staggering that after 8 months of since triggering Article 50, the government has made so little progress. The Secretary of State for International Trade said a deal with the EU should be the easiest in human history. That's what he said. Now the reality for this Tory government is beginning to bite. But if things do not improve, the reality may soon begin to bite for the jobs and living standards of the people of this country. These negotiations are the most important in Britain's recent history, vital to our future and vital to our economy. Just at the moment when Britain needs a strong negotiating team, we have a cabinet at each other's throats. Half of the Conservative Party want the Foreign Secretary sacked. The other half want the Chancellor sacked.
We want both of them sacked.
Mr. Speaker.
Order! I say to the honourable gentleman, the member for Braintree, that I'm advised that he is being groomed for statesmanship. And I say to the aspiring statesman, it is in the circumstances impolitic at best and rude at worst for him to point. I am trying to help the honourable gentleman. Jeremy Corbyn.
Rather than fighting over their own jobs, the reality is that millions of people's jobs and living standards depend on the success of these negotiations. If this government can't negotiate a deal for Britain, they should make way for a team that can.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman talks about what has happened over the last 15 months. Well, I'll tell him what has happened. This government has triggered Article 50 and is negotiating the leaving of the European Union. And we are negotiating the practical details that need to be in place to ensure that we first of all get the best possible deal for the UK, and that secondly, that we get a deal where the withdrawal is as smooth and orderly as possible. Now, he talks about a number of these issues. He says that the Florence speech was due to give momentum to the talks. Indeed, it has given momentum to the talks. But I happily say to the right honourable gentleman, the last thing we need in these talks is his momentum. He said, will we leave the single market and the customs union in March 2019? Yes, and I have said that we will. He says, will freedom of movement as we know it end? And I have said yes, and I've set out in the statement I made today, if he'd read it, the point about the difference that will come in during that period. He talked about citizens' rights. There is considerable agreement between us and the European Union on this issue. There are some remaining issues to be dealt with. I've been very clear at every stage that we want EU citizens in this country to stay. We welcome the contribution that they have made. But I'm also clear that we want UK citizens in the 27 member states of the European Union to be given their rights too. And everybody in this House of Commons should have a care for UK citizens as well as for EU citizens. And then finally, he says that this is a historic moment. It is indeed an important moment for this country. This is a very important and significant set of negotiations that will set this country's future for generations to come. I'm optimistic and ambitious about what we can achieve for our country. He said we need to negotiate carefully. Yes, we do. That's why the Article 50 letter reflected the principles I'd set out in the Lancaster House speech, and the Florence speech updates that and reflects again the principles of the Lancaster House speech. What a contrast with the Labour Party, which said that they would respect the result of the referendum, then voted against the withdrawal bill. They said they wanted to leave the single market. Now they say they might stay in the single market. They said that staying in the customs union was deeply unattractive. Now they want to stay in the customs union forever. And they used to be against a second referendum, but now they've refused to rule it out. With such a confused position on Brexit, no wonder they say there'll be a run on the pound if Labour get into power.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister reassure me that the statement clarifies that it's not the government's policy On the one hand, to seek to remove all trading barriers with countries like Japan and the United States, but on the other hand, to seek to create new regulatory, customs and tariff barriers with the European Union, with which at the moment we have free trade and which is our largest trading partner in the world. And if that is correct, and that is consistent perhaps with what she's just said, as she recalls no doubt that ultra-Brexiteers, including the present Foreign Secretary, assured citizens during the referendum campaign that no difference at all would take place in our trading relationships with Europe because they needed to sell us their Mercedes and their Prosecco, then would it not be best to proceed with the negotiations on the basis that our ideal solution would be to stay in the single market and the customs union, and she can then seek to negotiate changes to those conditions presently attached to that, which are the things to which she refers when she tries to explain where she is at the moment.
Well, my right honourable and learned friend has always been consistent on this particular issue of membership of the European Union. When people voted in the referendum and voted for the UK to leave the European Union, I think they were voting for us to take control of our borders, our laws and our money. If we were to remain full members of the customs union and the single market, that would bring with it continuing jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice into the future forever. It would also bring with it the requirement for free movement. What I have set out in the Florence speech and the offer that we have made to the European Union is what I've described previously as a deep and special partnership with the EU. And my right honourable friend and learned friend is right. We do want to ensure that the trading relationship we have with the European Union can be as tariff-free and as frictionless as possible. But we also see advantage in being able to negotiate new trading agreements around the rest of the world as well. I think that is to the advantage of the United Kingdom, and that's what the government will be pursuing.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of her statement. Although I must say that a statement that took 13 minutes to deliver, and not one mention of the devolved administration. That's the lack of respect that we see from President in London. And let me... You should be
Order. It is a considerable discourtesy, I say to the Honourable Gentleman of North West Leicestershire, to walk out of the chamber past the member who's on his feet in the middle of his attempted intervention. It is a point that is so blindingly obvious that it shouldn't need to be notified to the Honourable Gentleman. But as he wasn't apparently aware of the discourtesy involved, he now is. And when the House has settled down, perhaps we can hear the leader of the Scottish National Party, Order, who I remind the House must be heard, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, we respect the fact that the UK has voted to come out of Europe. But we were told in our referendum in 2014 that if we stayed within the UK, then our future in Europe would be preserved. And we have the situation today that Scotland has voted to remain, and in particular wants to stay in the single market and the customs union. It's about time that we got some respect from the government. Mr. Speaker, the situation is now critical. Can I say to honourable gentlemen, I can hear them chuntering. If they want to catch the Speaker's eye, they're entitled to do so, but perhaps they may show a little bit of respect.